Our next speaker is Kathleen Mullen.
It's a little hard to get out of there. All right, thank you very much for sticking around to the last session. I am going to be discussing joint work with a pretty large team, Nicole Maestas, who's at Harvard Medical School, David Powell and Jeff Wenger from RAND, and Till von Wachter from UCLA are all co-authors of mine on this research. And we would like to acknowledge funding from the RRC, for funding this research, which wouldn't have been possible without them, and also the Sloan Foundation, which has contributed to the funding on this, this project. So qualitative evidence of a gap between the jobs older workers want and the jobs available to them suggests that older workers desire, different things that you might expect that they would want. Particularly flexibility, meaningful work, pay and benefits, opportunities for advancement, supportive work environment, and opportunities to gain transferable skills. But it still remains to be seen whether these gaps have quantitatively important effects on labor force participation. Especially as a large team of people who's been doing a lot of work on working conditions, collecting new data on it, and trying to assemble a research agenda around this, we wanted to turn our attention to just trying to figure out how important are working conditions, to people, and thinking about the jobs that they want to do and whether or not they want to continue working. And that's the focus of this presentation, okay, I think the battery might be ready to go. I'm going to talk to you about some research where we conducted a series of stated preference choice experiments using a nationally representative internet panel, the RAND American Life panel, to elicit valuations of job attributes. And I'll explain a little bit more what that is. We got a taste of that, I think, yesterday. There was a presentation on using stated preferences where people were asked to think about different hypothetical scenarios if they had different health conditions. So we're going to be asking people to, assume their health and everything about them is the same now, but think about, what you would do if you're presented with these two jobs, and I'll show you more about how we characterize those jobs. So I'm going to present estimates of total valuations based on the incidence of these working conditions and compare them to nominal wages to assess the importance of working conditions. So this is like a really convoluted sentence. What I'm going to do is basically say, add up all the valuations of working conditions, for the set that we're looking at. We look at 10 different working conditions, put them in monetary terms, and then compare them to wages. And then I'm also going to show you some, what I think are intriguing results looking at, when you incorporate these valuations of working conditions, into, people's compensation. What does this do to, different wage gaps that we see? Particularly, I'm going to show you how valuing working conditions will change what you might think about, gender gap, the race gap in wages, education, and of course, we're all interested in age differences. So what are stated preferences, the research design that I'm going to be showing you estimates from? So basically what we're going to do is we provided hypothetical choices defined by observable attributes, and we're going to give people a menu of attributes that we associate with different jobs and different wages. And one nice thing about this is because we would observe the full choice set, we're basically giving people two jobs, and we're saying pick one of these two jobs. It's possible to estimate the importance of each attribute relative to price. So, under these conditions, people reveal the job that they would like to take. They don't necessarily say why that is, and we don't ask them to tell us in particular, like, how much do you value this working condition? We just say, here are some different working conditions, and here are some different wages. Which one would you like? And then we do this 10 different times for each person. So stated preferences have long been used in a variety of different contexts, and I just list some of them here. For those interested, you can go and look up some of these interesting papers. And there are some distinct advantages and disadvantages to this research design. So I've already touched on the first advantage, which is you observe the full choice set. In real world situations, you see what people earn, and you see the working conditions they have, but you don't see all the different possible jobs that they, turn down to accept the job that they're in. And people could have different, different choice sets depending on their skills and their education and different factors. So another interesting thing here is that we can account for differences across individuals. So we don't have to restrict our attention to people who are currently working and are currently, in different jobs. We can ask people who aren't working, let's think about these two jobs. Which one would you, choose if you had to? And it's possible to study behavior in counterfactual situations. So, can we, present people with different jobs that are pretty different from their current job and get them to think about, choices in a different sort of space in the state space. So the disadvantages are probably pretty clear. There's no real incentive to choose accurately here. We're relying on, people's goodwill and in thinking through this as a rational person and choosing what they really would choose. But of course, we're not forcing them to take one of these two jobs, so there aren't high stakes. And usually I have time to show you some evidence that people do seem to be pretty earnest in their attempts to work through these questions. They really enjoy answering these types of questions, and they kind of report back that it makes them think about their lives in meaningful ways. It's kind of interesting. Normally the surveys that I give people, they seem to think are torture. So that's nice there. But, and then, the salience of the options, of course, the flip side of we can observe them in counterfactual situations is, these are not necessarily jobs that are particularly salient for them. They can't necessarily think through, like, if I had these two types of jobs to choose from, they're very different from my current job, which one would I want? So I apologize, this is as big as I could get it, but I wanted to show you a screenshot of how we present these different scenarios. So we give instructions at the top that basically ask people, imagine that you're offered, I can't read that, it's too tiny even on this screen, but imagine you're offered one of the two jobs shown below, except for characteristics highlighted below. Please assume the jobs here are identical. So, like health insurance isn't up here, and we're asking people to assume that both of these jobs either do or don't offer health insurance, and that's set. And hopefully they're not, inferring that because of one of these working conditions, like that's associated with other things. So that's another assumption. So please, choose one of these jobs. And then we do allow them to scroll over, these definition or these characteristics on the left side, and they can get definitions of these things. So, if they don't know what telecommuting is, then they can scroll over it, and we give them a definition of that. So the attributes that we look at in this study are hours. And there's two dimensions to this, whether or not it's part-time and then a specific number of hours, given that it's part-time, and whether it's full-time, which we define as 35 hours a week or more per week. Control over hours, whether or not you can set your own schedule or have somebody set your schedule for you, whether you have the option to telecommute or not. One thing I found surprising in our data where we collected, characteristics of work and just people's actual jobs is actually 80% of workers in the US don't have the option to telecommute. So, we're all probably pretty used to that and think that's pretty widespread, but we're a pretty selected group in that regard. Physical demands, so we have three different possibilities here. One is moderate physical activity, and we also have mostly sitting and then heavy physical activity as possibilities. Whether the pace is relaxed or fast-paced, the level of independence, whether there's paid time off, whether you're working with others, and there's a bit of a twist there, but I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about it. So if you want, you can ask about it either here or after. Opportunities for training and impact on society is meant to measure meaningful work. And one thing, and then finally the pay. And one thing also, I should say is that when we constructed, we spent a lot of time figuring out how to construct these and did focus groups and sort of pilot experiments and things like that. We really wanted to make sure that nothing was sort of presented in a negative way, that they're all kind of positive ways of spinning around this. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So I'm not going to go through the estimates one by one, because what I really want to talk about just let's aggregate these together and think about their impact. But here is just estimates showing you our stated preference estimates in green versus compensating differential estimates. So for those of you who aren't familiar with compensating differentials, that's basically just looking at observed wages and observed working conditions and correlating the two. And so, as you might imagine, you often get the wrong sign when you look at, these correlations in the real world. And so, to give you an example, and in our stated preferences research design, we find that people would be willing to give up 6% of their wage on average to gain the option to telecommute. But the compensating differential estimates basically would imply that somebody would be that you would, let's say, it has to go the other direction, that they would lose 24% of their wage in order to, I guess, pay to avoid the option to telecommute. So that's pretty unrealistic, I think. So one nice sort of proof of concept is that our estimates actually go in the direction that you would expect them to go, where people pay for the thing or would be willing to pay for the things that you would hope they would be willing to pay for, unlike what you would observe just in the kind of literature. So how much do workers value working conditions overall? So just briefly, how do we estimate this? We have a model, a utility model, where we basically estimate people's utility for working in a particular job with different conditions, and the wage they gain plays in there too. And so we just equate their utility functions, with and without the working condition, and solve for the wage difference that would make them indifferent between those two jobs. And we estimate on average that workers value the 10 working conditions we study here collectively at 64% of their wage. So if you take somebody and you make them, you put them in the worst possible job, and then you put them in the best possible job with all the best, amenities, that difference is 64% of what they have now. So, and then I also teased you a little bit with, how does this vary by group? So I'm going to start out, I wish this were a little bit bigger, showing estimates of effects on the wage gap. So here, the first bar that I'm showing you is our estimated difference in, female wages compared to male wages. So that's the omitted category. Just looking at wages. And so the way that you want to interpret this is that women earn in our data 20% less than men. And this nets out, a whole bunch of different observable characteristics as well. So this is pretty, similar to what, others find. But on the other hand, they actually value their working conditions more than men. So the difference, so on average, women value the amenities of their jobs, 11.2% more than men. So when you actually combine these, this reduces the male-female wage gap. So it's still a statistically significant difference, but it's now reduced down to 9%. So for that group, you get sort of a little push, I guess, towards equality. On the other hand, if you look at the non-white versus white non-Hispanic gap, so the raw wages are 9% less for non-white versus white non-Hispanic. The difference in amenities is actually worse. It's larger, 13.3% difference. And so when you actually combine these two together, you find a difference of 22%, less for non-white versus white non-Hispanic when you're combining wages and amenities, the valuations of the amenities together. Non-college versus college graduate is huge. So, we estimate a 49% difference in the wages between non-college and college graduates. When you take into account amenities, that goes down to 70% difference, which is gigantic. And then finally, the one that you're probably most interested in is older workers versus prime age workers. So here I'm showing you the difference between 50 plus and 35 to 49-year-olds. And this little blue bar is 5%, higher for older workers, but it's statistically not significant. When we look at amenities, it's 7%, and that's statistically significant at 1% level. And so, together we find that basically older workers are better off than their prime age counterparts, by 12%. So, this is just, my way of showing you. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to say in words. The differences that we're finding depend quite a bit on allowing the preferences to vary flexibly across different workers. So, if you hold the preferences fixed and you just look at, incidence differences, it is true that, men and women and college and non-college have different working conditions. But if, just holding the average estimates of the valuations, these actually kind of wash out. And so it's really important to allow, men and women and older and younger and college and non-college to have different preferences over different amenities, to see some of these results. And I think that's it. So in conclusion, so our stated preference estimates imply on average that workers value the 10 working conditions that we study here in this paper collectively at 64% of their actual wages. And incorporating the value of working conditions narrows the gender wage gap, but it actually widens the gaps by race, education, and age. These valuation differences are mainly driven by differences in preferences, not just incidence of working conditions across workers. And so kind of to turn it around and think about, what does that mean for kind of, encouraging older workers to stay in the labor force? So our results suggest that understanding preferences over working conditions is going to be key. It's not just incidence differences and counting up, what do older workers have versus younger workers, but understanding, how these preferences differ, how they change over the life cycle, and incorporating those, that understanding into our understanding of how older workers make decisions about work and retirement. So thank you very much. Apologies for going over.